You're going to see record. All right, everyone. So good afternoon, and thank you for attending the Lunch and Learn series hosted by the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits, the North Carolina Office of Strategic Partnerships, and Volunteer NC. Today's program will be recorded and available on the Volunteer NC YouTube channel. The webinar link, as well as any materials provided by today's speaker, will be emailed to you by tomorrow afternoon, along with a survey and a link to register for our next program. As everyone enters the webinar, just a friendly reminder, please ensure that your microphone is muted. Please enter your name and the name of the organization you're with as you enter the Zoom. Make sure to place your questions in the chat box and I will read them out. So today's guest speaker, Ms. Joy Vermillion Heinsohn, will present today's topic, Philanthropy 101. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce our special guest before we start. Ms. Joy Vermillion Heinsohn is North Carolina State Government's first Philanthropy Liaison, a position she began amid the COVID-19 pandemic in 2021. In this role, her focus is on improving interaction between state government and the philanthropic sector, education, philanthropy, and government about each other, and encouraging collaboration on projects across the state. Previously, Joy spent over 22 years at the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, where she served in numerous pragmatic roles, including 6 years as assistant director. There, she managed multiple grant portfolios, developed a democracy portfolio, and oversaw the strategic assessment process that led to ZSR's current framework for grant making and learning. She has served on national, state, and local boards and commissions, including the Board of Trustees, Board of Visitors of Wake Forest University, the North Carolina Equal Access to Justice Commission, the Board of MCNC, the Board of the Environmental Grantmakers Association, the Steering Committee of the Funders Committee for Civic Participation, and was a founding member of the Board of the North Carolina Network of Grantmakers and the Shalom Project. She is a graduate of Leadership North Carolina and a former Whole Fellow of the Southeastern Council of Foundations. A native North Carolinian and a graduate of North Carolina Public High School, Joy received a bachelor's degree in politics from Wake Forest University and a master's degree in public administration from Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, where she was named a Lucius N. Littore Fellow. Joy resides in Winston-Salem, North Carolina with her husband and 2 children. Thank you so much, Joy, for joining us and serving as our guest speaker. The floor is yours.
Daphne, thank you so much for a very kind introduction. And I have admitted a few folks from the waiting room, and I think there are a few others in, so I'll turn that duty back over to you. But it's a real pleasure to be with all of you. I welcome you all to turn on your cameras if you would like, but I am going to be using a PowerPoint presentation, so there may not be need for that here in the beginning. I want to share a few things with you before we get started. One is that this is truly a Philanthropy 101. It is intended for folks who have not been engaged in grant making, seeking grants previously. So if you are someone who is a fundraiser or has been working on securing grants for some time, this is probably not going to be the session for you, and I will not be offended if you decide to exit at any point. So do what you need to do on that front, but I do want to be clear about who the audience is intended to be. The other thing that I want to mention is I'm going to do this session in a few parts, and I will pause at the end of those parts to see if there are questions thus far. And then we will have more time for Q&A at the end. But Daphne, I'm going to ask you to be timekeeper to make sure that I'm moving through as needed and that we've got plenty of time at the end. So don't be shy to interrupt me at any point if we need to keep moving. So with that, I'm going to try and pull up my screen here for all of you and hope that the technology will work. Great. Can everyone see that? Yes, definitely. Okay, thumbs up. Excellent. So our agenda for today, I'm going to start with some basics about what philanthropy is. What do we even mean when we use that term? I'm going to talk about the landscape of philanthropy in North Carolina, what that looks like here in our state, how to find grant opportunities, and some tips on applying for grants. A little word about the office in which I am situated before I get going, just so you'll have some understanding of where I'm coming from. The North Carolina Office of Strategic Partnerships was created to leverage the expertise of research institutions, primarily higher education, some nonprofits that are also engaged in research, and philanthropy in North Carolina. It was just created a handful of years ago. And the focus is really using research and evidence to help guide policy and process decisions in government. There are opportunities for many types of engagement with our office, short and long-term projects, projects with faculty and researchers and students across the state. Some of what we do is funded, and some of it we have to seek funding for. I should say my particular role as Philanthropy Liaison, which is trying to build partnerships between philanthropy and state government, is in and of itself a government philanthropy partnership. My position is funded both by philanthropy and by state government. Our partners include state agencies, higher ed, philanthropy, student interns, various national organizations as well. We've got a small but mighty team and also an advisory group. A quick word about what that really looks like in practice. One arm of our shop is working with state agencies to develop learning and research agendas, and we have something called the North Carolina Project Portal. These slides will be sent out to you afterwards, and you'll be able to click on these links if you would like. The Project Portal is really looking at how can we engage state agencies that have a research question that they want to explore, and connect them with researchers who can assist them in doing that research, to assist them in building evidence for their area of work. We've worked with a variety of agencies and have a number of those projects currently in the Project Portal if you'd like to take a look, or are with a research organization, and other projects that are underway, as well as those that have already been completed that you can see in the portal. We're really looking at work that's scalable and sustainable and can develop open source resources. And I would say this is also true for the philanthropy side of our work. So everything that I do, we try to put as resources on our website. Again, we'll send you the link, but there are a number of webinars that we've done that speak to philanthropy in North Carolina. Some of them are specifically for philanthropy. Some of them have been specifically for state agencies, and some that really are connecting the two. So in this role, I'm working less face-to-face with nonprofits, but I'm really thrilled to get to do that today with so many of you. We do receive daily requests in our office for assistance from universities and agencies and philanthropy and nonprofits and others who are trying to figure out, how can I build a cross-sector partnership? If I'm in a nonprofit and I'm trying to connect with somebody in a state agency, can you help me figure out who I need to be talking to? Or if I'm in a state agency and I want to be working with a researcher, how can you help me identify who the best researchers in North Carolina might be for that project? So there's a lot of the connecting of the dots that we do in our office. And like I said, several resources that we will send out to you at the end. I'll just point out that if you have interest in the kinds of things that I've described, feel free to sign up for our monthly Connect and our highlights, which is sort of our newsletter, if you will, so that you can get on our lists to receive invitations to those. So moving into our agenda for today, philanthropy basics. Philanthropy really includes the concept of voluntary giving by an individual or a group to promote the common good. This is a definition that is from the Council on Foundations, which is a membership association of foundations across the country. I'll say that many people also define philanthropy as giving of time, talent, or treasure. So there's no one definition for philanthropy, but for the purposes of today's presentation, which really is focused more on understanding the lay of the land in North Carolina and applying for grants, when I use the term philanthropy, I'm really primarily referring to monetary grants that are made by foundations in the state. Our friends at the North Carolina Network of Grantmakers, I just want to give a shout out to them. This is an association, a voluntary membership association of foundations across North Carolina. They've got about 114 members. They were very kind to share some of their slides with me that I've included in today's presentation, so definitely want to give them credit for that. Types of foundations. If you have not worked with foundations previously, it can be helpful to understand that they're not all the same. In fact, there are different tax codes in the IRS for different kinds of foundations. And so I wanted to walk through 3 different kinds of foundations. The first are private and family foundations. So typically, well, these are all entities that are required by law to give away 5% of the fair market value of their endowment every year. The IRS, there is an IRS distinction, there is not an IRS distinction between private and family foundations. So family foundations, if you hear that term, those are a type of private foundation. Typically, a family foundation would have at least one family member on its board. That would be a family member of the original donor. It could be several generations down the pike now, but still a family member, at least one on the board. Another type of private foundation to mention is a hospital or healthcare conversion foundation. You may have read about those. They typically are created when a nonprofit healthcare entity is sold to a for-profit entity, and the assets of that nonprofit go into an endowment or a trust, and a foundation is created then to distribute those assets. And the Dogwood Health Trust in Western North Carolina, the New Hanover Community Endowment down in New Hanover County are both examples of recent healthcare conversion foundations, but there are many others across the state. And so that's a type of private foundation as well. Community foundations. We have a robust network of community foundations in North Carolina. We are separated from many states in that way. I'm very grateful that we have the network that we do. And these foundations have specific geographic footprints. They often are both raising money in their communities and giving it away. Typically, a community foundation has numerous donor advised funds, which are created by individual donors. And those donors each get to decide how they want to spend the assets in those funds. And the foundation staff can help to advise them in that endeavor. Some donors to community foundations also allow the foundation itself to use some amount of their assets in their fund as an unrestricted pool of money that the community foundation staff and its board members can decide how to use. So those are discretionary funds for the community foundation. But for the most part, and you hear me say typically or for the most part a lot in this presentation because it is not a one-size-fits-all approach, for the most part, community foundations assets heavily lean towards having donor advised funds, and much less of their money is considered unrestricted for pooled giving in their community. In terms of corporate foundations and giving programs, some corporations have a corporate foundation, which is actually a separate legal entity from the corporation itself. They generally have a small endowment of some sort and rely on giving from the company to set that up. It may have tied the endowment itself, the corporate foundation may have ties to the corporation, but its work is separate. A corporate giving program, on the other hand, is essentially the charitable arm of the corporation itself. It is not a separate legal entity. It does not typically have an endowment. And often the giving may be employee driven and may include employee matching gifts and things of that sort. Sponsorships that you may see at various events often come from corporate giving programs. So that's a broad overview of some of the basics of different types of foundations. Let me pause and see what, if any, questions folks may have so far. Feel free to take yourself off of mute.
You mentioned how blessed we were in North Carolina, and that seems to be kind of what I've heard. Does North Carolina have a larger per capita group of foundations than other states?
That is a great question, and I don't know the answer to that in a way that I could really be accurate in answering that. I will say that often in the Southeast, folks have shared with me, boy, we wish that our state in X Southeastern state had the type of philanthropic giving that we see in North Carolina. So my sense is that it is much stronger here. In Georgia, there is a heavy concentration of philanthropy in Atlanta, and then it's fairly scattered around the rest of the state. There's a good bit of philanthropic activity in Florida. But when you look at other states, kind of South Carolina towards the deep South, they do not have the same type of philanthropic infrastructure that North Carolina has. It exists, it's there, and they're very good at what they do, but it is different.
Thank you.
I see a raised hand from Amy Jones.
Hi there. Going back to the slide, the just previous slide, where you had corporate foundations. Are you using the word corporate there kind of generically, and not necessarily as in like a for-profit corporation? I'm just thinking, I know of like large nonprofits that have foundations. FHI here in Durham has one, for instance, and even universities like Duke you can get grants from Duke. And so would that sort of be lumped in this corporate foundation, or, do they function differently?
It's a great question, and I am not an expert on the IRS tax code, so I'm hesitant to answer that. I will say that for purposes of this presentation, I was intending corporate to generally mean the for-profit sector, business and industry. In terms of the foundations that may be connected with higher education, and there are lots of those I would guess have a different type of tax status than, for example, they definitely would have a different tax status from, say, the corporate giving program of a corporation, because that is within the corporation itself. A corporate foundation, on the other hand, in terms of how the IRS views that, may be much more similar to other types of foundations, but don't hold me to that, because again, I'm no lawyer or legal expert on the differences in the tax code there.
And just for implications for grant seekers, though, is there something like, oh, well, corporate foundations would be much preferred over private foundations? I'm completely making that up, but is it just something to be aware of, that there might be different, requirements or something, depending on what type of funder you're working with?
And we'll get into a little bit of that later on, and looking at tips for applying for grants. In general, I would say it's just going to vary depending on what your need is and what the priorities of the particular foundation or giving program might be. So off the top of my head, I'm not thinking of a reason that you would definitely want to pursue a private foundation versus a community foundation versus a corporate foundation necessarily. I think it's going to depend heavily on what it is that you're going after, and where you might be most likely to find those funds. But let's talk about that a little bit more as we get to section 3. I'm going to keep us moving then. So then let's take a look at the landscape of philanthropy in North Carolina, somewhat to Joe's question here of how does North Carolina compare? Don't have a ton of comparisons here, but I do want to give you some data about the state. And this first slide actually is national in scope. These numbers are from last year from a group called Giving USA. And as you can see here, when you look at the US as a whole, the largest source of giving by far is individuals. I always think this is really helpful for nonprofits to see, because I think we often can get into thinking solely about foundations, when in fact there are lots of individual donors who can be very good to court as you're trying to do some fundraising as well. So 2/3 of the giving nationally coming from individuals, another 9% coming from bequests that they might make, and then only 23% coming from foundations and corporations. If we then go to North Carolina alone, it's unfortunate here, the data that we have is not fresh. So the next couple of slides are going to be fairly old, coming from 2018. The main point that I want you to see here, though, is that there are thousands of foundations in North Carolina. Very few of them, maybe a few hundred, are actually staffed in some way. And so typically when we're talking about philanthropy and foundations, we're talking about foundations that have staff who are reviewing applications in some way. So 2,100 foundations, over $18 billion in assets. I should share that this data comes from a group called Candid, which you can go online and take a look at. They are a subscription service primarily, but have a ton of data and a large database on foundations and their charitable giving. Total foundation giving to North Carolina organizations in 2018 was about 1.4 billion. And what you'll see is that roughly half of that came from foundations in North Carolina, and roughly half came from foundations outside of North Carolina. And then what you see on this chart is that the vast majority of foundations are small in terms of their assets. Don't get me wrong, $1 million is a whole lot of money in my mind. However, when you're a private foundation, if you have assets of $1 million, that means you're giving away about $50,000 a year. So when you think about how much money that actually is going to be to support organizations and their good work across the state, you see that we have lots of foundations that are very small in terms of their assets. And then we have many fewer foundations that have large assets, and they give out the majority of the money. Foundations are primarily known for giving away grants, but many of them play other roles as well, as noted here on the screen. They may have content expertise in their priority areas. They may have knowledge of what's happening in the communities where they are situated. They have the ability to convene stakeholders, the ability to use their voices to educate and sometimes advocate, and to provide assistance to organizations in a way that helps build their capacity in ways beyond a grant itself. So I always like to point this out to folks, because when we think of foundations, it's really easy to think of them as a bank of sorts. And in fact, they've got many other assets aside from the dollars that they give away that can be very useful to nonprofits and communities. So before I go on to how to find grant opportunities, let me just stop and see if you have questions about the landscape of foundations in North Carolina. Okay, let's keep moving then. So in terms of how to find grant opportunities, there's no one right answer to how to do this. What I'm sharing in this presentation is, first of all, resources for grant seekers, which is a document that we've created at the Office of Strategic Partnerships, which again, we will be sending to you as part of this presentation. What we've tried to do in that document is to say, if you are new to this, here is a list of ways that you could approach seeking grants. It is not exhaustive or comprehensive, but we are trying to provide a number of examples. And so I've even done that on this slide. If you are interested in exploring federal grants, grants.gov is the website that you would visit. That's government grants. It's not all national funders, but federal agency grants. The state of North Carolina, which I'll speak more about in just a second, also has a site that you can search. And then there are many sites out there that have databases for foundation grants. And so if you are funding early literacy and you are looking for funders that fund early literacy in the foundation space, then you can go to one of these free sites, or some of them are by subscription, and become a subscriber and start doing searches for funders that might fit the criteria that you're looking for. So this document, Resources for Grant Seekers, has many more examples and can walk you through some of that. I also really like to recommend that folks sign up for newsletters and alerts from any foundation or agency that they think is a fit for the work that they do. Work can change over time at a foundation or a state agency or federal agency. And so being on their list and knowing when some of those priorities are changing and when their deadlines are, et cetera, is really important. And then also in this Resources for Grant Seekers document, we've got some examples of places you can go for news and information about philanthropy. And so some of those are subscription, some of them are not, but it gives you a taste of what's happening in that field and how to think about how your work is or isn't aligned with some of what you're reading there. I wanted to note in particular a new page on the nc.gov website, which is the state government website in North Carolina. We have worked with the Department of Information Technology to create a new page. This has only been live for a few months now, where we've tried to catalog the state grant opportunities across state agencies and put them on one page on the nc.gov website, and we've made it searchable so that you can go in, you can put in keywords related to the work that you do, and then see which of these opportunities might come up. I will also say, while it's a somewhat lengthy list, it's not, it would not take you too long to actually then just scroll through the whole thing rather than doing a search. So if you do a search and something doesn't quite come up that's fitting whatever keywords you put in, I recommend just sort of scrolling down through the whole page and seeing if anything jumps out at you. But we really hope that this is going to be useful to North Carolina nonprofits. So let me pause again there and see if you all have questions on these how to find grant opportunity tips.
I just wanted to, I put it in wrong the first time. Grantmakers Io is a nonprofit service that just takes the 940 information for everybody, and it's searchable and filterable. And that might be another good place to go, as opposed to, you know, some of the Grant Station and other people. It doesn't cost anything for smaller groups like ours.
Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out. And I do believe that the IO is listed as a resource in the Resource for Grant Seekers document, but that is a document that we really want to crowdsource. So I appreciate you saying that, Joe. And if there are others of you who take a look at that document and say, hey, we use this resource and y'all don't have it listed, please let us know, because we will continue adding to it and updating it so that everyone has the benefit of those types of tips. So thank you. Okay, well, let's keep moving forward then. So a few tips on applying for grants. I will say there is a huge amount of information on the internet and in libraries about this topic. There are hours and hours and hours worth of videos and webinars and tutorials and such that you can find. So what little bit I'm going to be sharing with you today is really just the tip of the iceberg. And on this particular slide, I've just listed three resources. So I already mentioned grants.gov to you. But what I want you to see here is that it's not just a place to identify potential grant opportunities. They've also got some tutorials. And if you are looking to apply for grants with federal agencies, I highly recommend going to the site, poking around, finding the tutorials that they have that can help you walk through how to apply for a federal grant. Candid is another site that it is a subscription-based site. It's not free. It's one of the ones that has a database of foundations, et cetera. However, they do have some free learning opportunities on their site, some free trainings. So again, if you go on and kind of poke around at the learning opportunities there, you may find that some of those would be great introductions for you, some introduction to grant type webinars. And then I also wanted to point out that many community colleges and universities in North Carolina do offer grant writing classes, and many of them are very reasonably priced. Some of them are virtual as well. So you might see whether your local community college offers a grant writing class. If it doesn't, you might search to see about other North Carolina colleges or community colleges that offer a virtual training that you may be able to join. The next tip I want to offer is that when you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. You may have heard that line before, but it is very true. They are all so different from one another in terms of their priorities and their geographies, their application processes, their reporting processes, and so on. So don't assume that when you work with one foundation, that whatever that process was is going to be the same for the next foundation that you might approach. I will also note the same is true for applying to government agencies. They are all very different. They have different grant management systems. They have different application processes, et cetera. So that can be challenging, I think, for nonprofits when you're trying to keep up with so many different ways of doing business. But I think it's important to understand that on the front end. The second tip that I would offer is because every foundation is so different, you really want to do your homework and get to know whatever foundation you've identified as a possible fit as best as you can. A lot of the information is on their websites and is really meant to help nonprofits better understand whether the nonprofit's work aligns well with the foundation's grant making priorities. So I strongly suggest that before you call or email a foundation to see if your organization is a fit, that you review their website carefully. It can also be a good idea to read their annual report. That can give you a sense of the kinds of grants that they've made in the past and at what level. Because if, for example, this is a foundation that you haven't applied to before, and you see that their average grant size is, let's say, $25,000, then that may help you think about what's going to be an appropriate ask for my organization to make. So the annual reports can often be found online on their websites. You might also look at their 990s, and often they are listed there as well. Some foundations have staff, typically called program officers, who are tasked with being the liaison between the grant applicants and the trustees. I borrowed this particular graphic from our friends at the NC network of Grantmakers to show how some program officers feel about their work, but also really to drive home the point about doing homework before contacting the foundation. If you have reviewed a foundation's website and still have questions, then by all means, contact the foundation to see if staff can help answer some questions. And they often very much want to talk with you, want to have a conversation, want to assist you. But often foundations only have a few staff. And so they want to make sure that you're not going to be wasting your time and they're not going to be wasting their time if someone hasn't yet taken a look at what's already readily available on their site. So if you do get to that point where you want to reach out and have a conversation, foundation staff will certainly help you as best they can. And it's best to try and have that conversation as far in advance of the application deadline as possible. Obviously, there are times when you find out about an application deadline days before it is due. completely fine to still contact the foundation after you've looked at all their materials and say, I've still got a few questions. That is typically not going to be used against you in any way, and certainly say, we just learned about this opportunity and we're excited by it. We've got a few questions about it. And if your organization's work is a good fit for that foundation, then a program officer or other staff person can offer guidance on how to help you make your case. I think it's also important to note, because there are real power dynamics between foundations and nonprofit organizations. A lot of foundations do recognize that and want to be careful in their approach. They recognize they can't do their work without you. The assets of the foundation are going to do no good if they don't have strong grantees with which to partner. So definitely reach out if you want to talk something through and get some advice. I'd also say that if you've never written a grant application, don't immediately assume that you need to hire a grant writer. Often foundations really want to hear from the people who are closest to the work. It could feel overwhelming at first if you've never written a grant application, in which case finding some of those online tutorials or taking a grant writing class could be helpful. And I'm not saying that you should never hire a grant writer. There may be cases in which that makes a lot of sense and is important to do. But I've often seen very small nonprofits spend what little money they have in their budgets on hiring a grant writer. And sometimes those grant writers, because they're not as close to the work, end up writing applications that are not as successful. So once you identify a foundation that you think could be a fit, I would read their application carefully and then see whether or not you think you really need outside assistance or whether you think you can tackle it yourself. And there are some foundations that are willing to give feedback after the grant cycle. Not all of them do, but some of them will, and it's certainly worth asking whether they could provide any feedback to you if you get the grant or you don't, about what was successful or what wasn't successful in the application. The last thing I'll say about this is recognize that if an application is not successful, it isn't personal and it's not a no forever. It may be that it's not a good fit for the foundation's priorities, and there's not going to be much that they can do to help your application move forward. It may be that they have an enormous number of grant applications and they had to find a way to prioritize, and for whatever reason, your application did not rise up the way some others did. Like I said, if that's the case, if they're willing to tell you more about why, certainly try and get that information. But as I mentioned earlier, foundation priorities can and do change over time. And so just because they said no this time doesn't mean it's going to be a no next time. It could be that there are a couple of things that you all could shift and might be a better fit next time. It could be that their application numbers are going to be down next time and maybe you've just got a better shot. It could be that they changed their grant making programs and now there's a different program that you're working on that is going to be a fit in the way that the previous one wasn't. So do get on those newsletters to see, when is this foundation changing some of the work that it does. This is my contact info. I would say, again, most of my work really is bridging philanthropy and state government. So, face-to-face with nonprofits each day is not as much a part of that, but I really want to be as helpful to folks as I can. And certainly if there's something about this presentation that wasn't clear or you have questions about, I hope you will reach out and let me know. So let me open up the floor at this time for any questions that you all may have, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see some of you if you're willing to come off camera.
Thank you, Joy, so much. I would definitely agree with what you said about hiring a grant writer. We did that for a few times and made the decision to really, write those narratives in-house, and it has made a huge difference. It was an
Oh, good.
overnight shift.
Wow.
What we're hearing is, we felt the heart of what's happening. And, when you touch their heart, then they're more freely with their hand. So, yeah.
Marian, I'm so glad you brought that up. And I will say, I've often shared with folks, because as Daphne mentioned, I spent a lot of years at a private foundation. There are folks who are making decisions at foundations who are heavily focused on the data, the numbers.
Right.
And there are folks who are heavily motivated by story. And so I think part of the task for nonprofits is how can I share both the kind of data and numbers side of my work, as well as the story and the heart of my work in a way that whoever is reading this can sort of get what they need from that.
Right. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for all these resources too.
Certainly.
Mhm.
And Joy Beth has a question. She has her hand raised.
Great.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for a very clear and direct presentation. I appreciate the information you provided. One thing that is kind of curious to me, and you've touched on this and wonder if you could say some more, is basically a debriefing, especially with grants that you've applied for with the state. And just a little bit of my personal background was I worked for NIH for a long time with doing grants, and that was very much a part of what our job is to provide feedback to anybody who applied. So I find it frustrating that there's on the state level, and maybe, well, I just find that frustrating. I can understand foundations a little bit better, but it's just like so frustrating.
I hear that. And in some cases, I would say it is more of just a choice. And this is not just true for the state. I would say this is true for whoever is making grants. I've seen it happen for a few different reasons. In some cases, it is choice. For whatever reason, that grant maker decides how we make decisions is something we're going to keep private, and we're not going to share any information with grant applicants about what worked well or what didn't. In other cases, it's not so much a principle stance like that. It's more of, we just don't have staff time to do that. We got 200 applications. We were only able to make 50 grants, and we just don't have the staff time to speak with 150 organizations about what didn't work. And so I think there really can be different reasons that an agency or a foundation can decide not to do that. Or it may be, in some cases, I know of some foundations that actually make time to speak with everyone who did not receive a grant and talk with them about it. In other cases, I've seen, well, if they contact us, then we'll have a conversation. But if they don't contact us, we're not going to take it on ourselves to reach out. So it varies widely. And I think even within state agencies or federal agencies, the expectation can really vary, not only from agency to agency, but even from program to program within or across agencies. But I hear your frustration, Beth.
Thank you.
Joy, we have another question as well from Tackle, if that's correct. Please forgive me if I messed that up.
No, you're all right. It's Daphne, right?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Thanks, Daphne. And I would like to foot stomp the last two speakers in saying thank you again, Joy, for a wonderful presentation. Joy, as you know, I'm a fellow based here from in North Carolina for about 3-4 months, and I reside in New Zealand. And I'm an academic at one of the universities in New Zealand. So my question is more of wanting to know whether you have a sense of whether the corporate donors or the corporate philanthropists or funders, whatever term works best, are open to research from or to researchers from outside the shores of the United States. And I ask for two main reasons. The first one is, in New Zealand, we just don't have the kind of money that the US has, right? And then secondly, if we are focusing on an issue that has global significance, for example, my research is on the midwifery workforce, which is a global issue. They're having significant recruitment, retention, and sustainability issues. Would they be open to that for me to just do almost blue skies research, or is there more of a requirement to have an American partner, something that I'm willing to invest time and energy into it? But I'd just like to know, are they open to that? I'm assuming your federal and state funders are probably going to insist that it's a local researcher who might partner with me to get international data. But if you could just speak to some of that, I'd really appreciate it. And thank you.
Sure, thanks, Tago. And we're thrilled to have Tago on our team for a few months. The short answer, Tago, unfortunately, is going to be, it just varies. So I can't give you a straight answer on, yes, there's a significant portion of corporate foundations who would be interested in the kind of work that you're describing. Part of what can be so difficult in fundraising is there are some really niche priorities at foundations out there. So if you go onto one of these databases and do some searches to try and uncover who might be a good fit for the kind of work that you do, my guess is that you will inevitably come across a few funders where you go, wow, that is a niche, that's a niche priority area. So when folks have resources, have money that they put into trusts, they can, of course, make whatever determination they want about how they want to prioritize the grants that are made. So it may be, Tago, that there are some niche foundations, whether they're corporate or otherwise, that may be very interested in the kinds of things that you are describing. The other thing I'd offer is, as you saw on one of the earlier slides, a lot of the money, roughly half of the money that was coming into North Carolina organizations was from out of state. And then there are a lot of foundations that are based in North Carolina who give outside of state lines, and that could be national or international. So there are lots of opportunities to search for the kinds of things that you're looking for, but I don't know off the top of my head about any one category of funder that may be more inclined to what you're describing.
Thank you, that's really helpful.
And Joy,
Other
the threshold time is 1:48.
Great. Happy to answer any other questions that folks might have.
I think what I'm running into is how do you approach each funder? And I hear what you say about reading the 990 and reading their webpage, but you know, it's still a shot in the dark every single time. And I had somebody who told me to try to contact the main grant maker by phone before sending a letter of request in. But, you know, that's the balance, it seems. And I guess that's a skill we need to develop.
And that is, it's so hard because, as you say, some people might tell you, with this funder, call them in advance. Or it may say on their website, please give us a call before you begin the application process. With others, you're going to go on their site and it's going to say, we don't accept unsolicited applications. And you're going to think, well, how on earth are you ever going to know how great my work is? How does anybody ever get an audience with you? There's just not one way that this work is done. And it can be exhausting and time consuming as a result. That's where I do think that at least using some of these databases, whether they're free or subscription, if you can afford it, to help you whittle down some of, who might be a good fit for our work, I do think can be useful. I do recommend that folks try not to put all of their eggs in one basket, of really putting your hopes on this one funder that you think, oh, I know we're aligned. I know they're going to fund us because our work is right up their alley. And if you put all your eggs in that basket, you could be real sad and disappointed at some point. So trying to find a few different funders that you can approach, I do think, but it is time consuming to go through all of those websites or look through those 990s for information.
And Beth, we have a question from Miss Amy Jones.
All right, I'm kind of switching gears a bit. Can you talk a bit, what triggered it was, this whole idea that you just mentioned of sometimes that they're not accepting unsolicited proposals for work. And you're like, well, how do we get in? And I mean, we all know how you get in is, somebody and you're like, you come from a similar background. And so I guess my question is, can you discuss anything that your office or maybe like the higher office above you is doing to address the inequities and make this process more inclusive? Because, we all know that philanthropy has historically and currently is kind of an old white boys club in a lot of cases.
Yes. Whew, yes. So there are, so much of what you said resonates in terms of just how the lack of transparency that exists in the field of philanthropy and these power dynamics that are at play. So a few thoughts about what you just shared. I think what you just said can often be true. If it's an organization that doesn't accept unsolicited applications, then sometimes it becomes do you know somebody who knows somebody who might be on the board, who might be willing to hear about my proposal? I will also say, I don't think it really ever hurts if they've got an, info@xfoundation.org email on their website somewhere. I don't think it ever hurts to send something to them that says, I noticed you only accept solicited applications. I'm not sure, I couldn't find on your website a process for, identifying potential new organizations. If you have such a process, I'd love to share some of our organization's information with you. So I don't think it hurts to try and contact them in that way. I will say one of the things I have noticed, and I'm not here to argue it for or against, I'm just here to share information. I think that there are some foundations that have chosen early on to do solicitation only, in part for control, maybe, but also in part because they don't want to be spending a lot of money on staff. They would rather spend more money on grants. And so the trade-off that they have chosen to make is we're going to have really slim staff, but that means we're not going to have the staff to review a lot of applications. And so the flip side of that is going to be we're going to do solicited applications. So you can say that's the wrong approach. And again, I'm not here to say it's right or wrong, but I do think that's a lot of what I have actually seen happen with foundations that take that approach. Not all, but many. So in terms of what are we doing to try and address some of this, we partner regularly with the North Carolina Network of Grantmakers, and a lot of those conversations that they are helping to spearhead are asking these kinds of questions of funders. How do you approach this work and why? What are the values that influence that? What can you learn from your neighbors, et cetera? I've seen some foundations who are even willing to share applications. They've put a checkbox on their application that asks the applicant, are you willing for us to share your application with other funders? And if you click yes, then when they get through the end of that grant process, whether you got a grant or didn't, they may pass your application on to another funder that they know is also interested in that work. So more things like that are beginning to happen among grant makers, which I think is great. And the last thing I'll say, Amy, is our office actually has started a series of conversations within and across state agencies. North Carolina state government has had on and off through the years, it's my understanding, a place for folks who do grant making to come together as a learning community on kind of how to do grant making better. That hadn't existed for a few years. We've started it again. And so these are the kinds of questions that I think we're going to be posing over time, is sort of how can one agency help inform another agency's work around how to be more transparent and open and accessible and that sort of thing.
And we are at the 5-minute mark. Maybe we can take 1 or 2 more questions before we wrap up.
If there aren't other questions, I would also just love to open the floor to see if you all have other suggestions. If I know this is 101, but if any of you have done grant applications previously and have other tips or things that you want others on this call to know, would love for you to put those in this space.
I'll just echo something you said about check the formatting requirements. I had a conversation just yesterday with an organization or a program under USDA. And so if you're applying for this grant, you would be doing so through grants.gov. And the woman said, on grants.gov, they accept formats other than PDF. You can upload files in Word documents or whatever. So it looks like you've done it correctly, but their system, their USDA system, does not accept anything that's other than a PDF. So, I mean, like even within the same world, like you can upload something and they would never get it if it wasn't PDF. So like just to echo pay attention to those instructions, because a lot of times they change minute by minute.
And I really liked when you said that the grants change over time. Not only are the foundations in many cases looking to spread out what they do, but priorities change and the number of people who apply change and what people are looking for change. And as a board of directors or a search committee changes, that changes the things they think are important. And we've gotten grants one year and not gotten it the next. And it's a balancing act.
Yes. Anybody else have tips?
I have a question, little different, down a little different track. What are funders like? Say you apply 1 year, and whether you got it or got.
Can you all hear me?
In other cases, you may decide that, as you look back, the data is a little bit out of date. You want to make sure that you're changing some things on your end, or this is maybe a foundation that has a reputation for wanting projects that are new and shiny. And so you think to yourself, well, maybe that's not going to be the best approach, is to recycle. My take is to be as honest and open about what you need as you can. So I think being truthful about here's where we are and here's what we're doing. It may or may not have changed a ton from the last time that you applied, but as long as you are providing a truthful answer on this is where we are and what we're hoping to do over the course of this next year, even if it's kind of similar to what you did last year, I still think that's putting your best foot forward.
Okay, thank you.
Daphne, I think we are right at 2 o'clock. So I want to thank everyone so much for sticking with us this long, and turn the floor back over to you for any closing remarks or housekeeping.
Thank you so much, Joy. And I hope you all can hear me. My computer actually shut down in the middle of everything. So I'm hoping that you all can hear me. But Joy, I want to say a big thank you for taking the time to share your expertise with us. And I want to say a big thank you also to our participants for joining us today and some really great questions. As a friendly reminder, participants, you will receive the following. You will receive today's webinar link, a survey for today's program, in addition, materials from today's program. When you have the opportunity, please take a few moments to complete our survey. The responses will allow us to continue providing webinars relevant to your organization. Thank you once more and have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.